So I'm of the opinion that Game of Thrones is the greatest television show of all time. And even if you don't necessarily agree with that, I think there's no denying the monumental contribution the show has made to the industry of just taking a big budget, quality television to a whole new level. And so the idea of having a book that would give us an inside look into the process of what it takes to make this wonderful production sounds like such an amazing idea. So why in seven hells did they do such a bad job of it with this book? Okay, so I might be a little bit harsh in this review. I think the harshness will stem from a place of disappointment that I really expected a lot more from this book that it just did not deliver on. Well, first of all, let me say the actual physical book itself is gorgeous. Everything from the cover, which is sort of like that, that soft sort of squishy cover, just the intricacies of the design on every page, the layout, the quality of the photos, the layout of the typography, everything, it is presented phenomenally. The problem is the content itself. So before I completely get up on my soapbox for a bit of a rant, let me just point out the things that I really did like in the book. So beyond the actual physical presentation of the book, the way the content is presented is also really well. It's not sort of like in a lot of making of books, you're sort of getting, the author is sort of giving you this sort of magazine, film, journalist type perspective where they talk about the production of a film or TV series as an outsider. What this book does is it's almost entirely, when it's actually talking about the making of the series, it presents the information as sort of an oral history, or rather like a commentary track by the cast and crew. And so you'll see as we go through that the body of the text is made up of this style where you have someone's name and then a 1 or 2 sentence quote from them, which is actually a much more simple way to present the information, and oftentimes a lot more effective. The only problem is that because people are only getting 1 or 2 sentences, it does have a tendency to feel a little bit soundbitey rather than hearing the cast and crew go into anything with any real depth. But it is definitely an interesting idea that I haven't really seen in too many making of books, but it's just a shame it's not really used effectively here. The main offenders are the actors. There's far too much commentary by the actors, quotes from the actors, and they do something that is certainly not exclusive to this book or the Game of Thrones cast, but actors in general, is the things that they're talking about are just like who their character is, their character's motivation, the psychology of their character. Very shallow, boring stuff that anyone who's watched the show will already be able to discern. The best stuff is when you're getting the quotes from a production designer, a costume designer, a director. That's when you're actually getting some really good insight, but like I said, it's pretty short. And honestly, in terms of content, that's actually kind of the only good thing I can say about the book. And I know all the fanboys and girls are gonna, dislike this video, but I do absolutely consider myself a fanboy of this franchise. But this is just the fact of the matter is, it is an incredibly shallow book. It looks fantastic. The content is shallow. There's just way too much recapping of characters and events. It really kind of feels less like a making of book or behind the scenes book, and more of like a guide to the world sort of thing. There's too much of that stuff. There are other books that do that and do that really well, and unexpected for it to be in this book. Just pages of, every time it talks about a character, just gives you a recap of who they are, a recap of the different houses. Then there's always, for each character, the actor will talk again, just saying the sort of comments that I mentioned before, the really shallow stuff. And then when anyone else, like a director or something, or the creators of the show, are talking about one of the actors, it's always them just absolutely fawning over the actor and saying how they are so amazing, the only person who could have possibly played this character. And with maybe the exception of Peter Dinklage, I find that hard to believe, and it's just a lot of patting each other on the back, and it's just old and unnecessary. What's very interesting, I should point out very quickly, is that it's by a writer and producer of the show. So you would hope that that means he has unparalleled access and insight into how this show was made, which I'm sure he does. It just does not come across at all in this book. And it's really a shame to see a lot of the sort of more story elements and characters being recapped, taking up whole pages, but then whole creative departments, their sort of role in creating the show is boiled down into such a tiny space at the expense of that other stuff, and it's very disappointing. Also, far too many screenshots from the series, not enough behind the scenes photography, not enough concept art, but when it is there, it's fantastic. It's just there's simply not enough. Again, like I said, the book looks fantastic, and the imagery is great because the show is so beautifully shot, but it's just not what I was hoping or expecting for this sort of book. And what I find kind of interesting, also kind of frustrating, is that this idea of not getting enough insight into the show is not a problem that's exclusive to this book. I remember for season 1 and 2, they also had like a video series that was on like YouTube and iTunes and stuff that were, I think, like, you know, for each episode they do like an inside episode 8, something like that, to try and give you a behind the scenes look at the show. And all it ever was just, you know, David Benioff and David Weiss just recapping what had happened in the episode, talking again about character motivations. And this is from the creators of the show, and they really never actually gave any. There was lots of great behind the scenes footage that was featured in those, but the actual commentary by the creators of the show, the showrunners, was just completely lacking, and actually kind of non-existent. However, there was the occasional episode in that series of videos called like Meet the Artisan, which would focus on like the costume designer, the fight choreographer, production design, something like that. Those were really cool, but they were only about like 3 minutes in length. So, and then furthermore, there was a whole blog called The Making of Game of Thrones by Brian Cogman. That is such a cool idea, because, you know, it's like you can't possibly fit the whole making of such an epic show into you know, of 2 seasons into one book. So this idea of having a sort of ongoing production blog sounded like such a cool idea, you know, every episode a week, whatever. I was sort of expecting that it would almost be like a diary of the making of the show, or even just like each week, you know, featuring one different sort of department or aspect of the show. And it was never that. All it ever was him saying like, "Brr, it's cold in Ireland. Today production is moving to such and such a place," and then hyping you up for the next episode. "Be sure to tune in next week when Sansa gets a visit from a mysterious stranger." And it's just like, for a blog called The Making of Game of Thrones by one of the producers of the show, for it to feature zero, and I really mean zero, actual production information was just so frustrating for me. I don't know if it still is being run or exists, or if it's changed and got better, because I never went back to looking at it. And also I listened to the commentaries on the season 1 DVD, which were, again, likewise, so shallow, so uninsightful for the most part. There was some good stuff, but it was like, you know, there'd be a whole episode where the commentary would be by George R.R. Martin, who, you know, created the books, created this whole world. He, you know, produces the show, he writes for the show as well. If anyone in the whole world would have absolutely fascinating insight into the creation of this show, surely it would be him, right? And there were just some points during when he would just say painfully obvious stuff. He'd be like, "And here you see Jon Snow wants to join the Night's Watch." And then, you know, on screen Kit Harington would be like, "I want to go join the Night's Watch." And it's like, again, just, you know, saying stuff that's blindingly obvious rather than giving any true insight to how the show was made. So, you know, I've seen the online videos, I've followed the blog, I've got these books, I've listened to the commentaries. I also haven't listened to any of the more recent season's commentaries, just because, you know, I was a bit put off by the first season, so maybe they've improved as well. But anyway, that's a lot of stuff that I have attempted to devour to understand the making of this show, and yet I feel like I know almost nothing, and it's just so bizarre. I can't understand why they have completely mismanaged every opportunity to give fascinating insight into one of the most lavish, biggest, epic productions ever televised. So yeah, it's just been a really disappointing process. Now, one thing I can recommend is that for last season they released a video that was, I don't know, maybe like 10-12 minutes long, that was a day in the life of the production of Game of Thrones. Now that was an excellent behind the scenes look at what it takes to create the show, and like it sounds, it was just like showing a day in the life of the making of the show. So if you are interested, you should definitely go check that out, even though it is altogether too short and makes me wish they treated all their behind the scenes looks in the same way. But that yeah, really is pretty good. And this book I really had high hopes for, was very excited for. Disappointed that they were compressing 2 seasons per book, but even more disappointed when I found out that really they didn't even have enough content to warrant that. So I realize I am probably definitely being too harsh on the book, but it really does reflect my disappointment in it, and also disappointed in the sort of rave reviews that other people give it elsewhere. Because when you rave and praise a book or anything that isn't deserving, what you're essentially doing is giving the creators, the publishers, authors permission to sell you books, DVDs, etc. of lower quality content. You're saying, yeah, when you give a book like this a 5-star review, you're saying, yeah, it's okay. This is what we should expect is, when we want to get, art or insight into a production, we're happy to pay instead for just, a lazy recap of who a character is. And I don't know, I'm just very uncomfortable with that idea. But anyway, that's probably enough of a rant for now. Because at the end of the day, if I had my time again, I'd still get this book. To be perfectly honest, I am disappointed with it. It's not what I had really hoped for and expected. It is very shallow, like I said, but I would still absolutely get it again. There's a second volume out that covers seasons 3 and 4. I've already got that. The reason is because, I am just such a huge fan of this show that, even this presents it's got such a small amount of meat on the bone, but I'm so hungry for any information on the show, any chance to dive back into this world. So in that way, I do understand why people love it so much, I guess, because, in a sense, it's really the show you love, and I get that. The book does help reflect that, and like I said, there are nice bits in the book. It's not, I don't want to make it sound like the book is trash. It's just a little bit disappointing. So maybe if you haven't read the book yet and you're watching this, you can measure your expectations accordingly, and then in that case, you may actually be pleasantly surprised and have a really great time reading the book. Oh, and one other point of interest is that there was also a collector's edition, and just off the top of my head, I can't think of any art and or making of book that has a collector's edition that I think is actually worth paying the extra money for. I think the collector's edition for this was maybe 6 times the price of this book, and what it was it came in a box. It was the exact same book, no extra content, no fancy cover or anything like that, just the book in a box, and then a quite a nice map of Westeros, but I don't really care about that. The one thing that it did have that was really a good addition to the collector's edition was that there was a second book of the storyboards for the show. Now that was really cool. Not good enough to warrant spending such a high price point, but it was good to see something at least of value included, rather than the typical fare of just having a slipcase and some art prints. But that might be something you're interested in as well. So hopefully I'll have better news to report with regards to the second volume in this series.